Yes, sir, go ahead.
Yes, sir. Charles McDonald, Mr. President, it's a pleasure to be here. I thank you from the bottom of my heart for your support, certainly for all the sheriffs in North Carolina, if not all of law enforcement.
Well, Congressman Meadows is a big fan of yours, that I can tell you. You know who I'm talking about, right?
Thank you, sir.
He's a good man.
I've been very impressed, Mr. President, with a lot of the ideas I've heard just since before you came in, actually, and I do think mental health is a serious issue. It's affecting us across the nation. I know it is in North Carolina. I appreciate your courage, sir, to talk about the fact that I do think there is a place for properly trained people in certain areas as well. I think multi-layered, like an onion, security's got a lot of facets, and I believe that you've got certainly the courage and leadership to bring all of this together. I know there's a lot of good ideas out there. I think they all need to be listened to, but it's going to take a lot of courage on the part of leaders, I think, in this nation to bring the community together to help them do the things really want to do in their heart, but maybe haven't had the courage to do yet. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Sheriff. It's going to take a lot of political courage, you're right.
Yes, sir.
A lot of political courage. Some of it won't be politically correct, but time for political correctness is over. We have to get this problem solved. So you're right about that. Thank you.
And I'm Vladimir Duterte. Thanks for joining us. So on Twitter today, President Trump called for a series of gun control measures. In a tweet, he wrote that he will be pushing for comprehensive background checks with an emphasis on mental health.
He also wants to raise the age restriction for buying rifles to 21 and end the sale of bump stocks. He also clarified his position on allowing guns on school campuses, writing that he wants to look into the possibility of giving concealed guns to gun adept teachers with military or special training experience. Only the best. He goes on to write that 20% of teachers, a lot, would now be able to immediately fire back if a savage sicko came to school with bad intentions.
David Hogg, one of the students from Stoneman Douglas High who survived the school shooting that killed 17 people, responded, writing, "That's your opinion, and I respect that, but I absolutely disagree. I don't think we have the time or money to train teachers. Hashtag never again."
So this all comes after an emotional listening session with victims of gun violence yesterday. Students, teachers, and parents who have all been impacted by school shootings spoke directly to President Trump, demanding changes on gun safety. As Margaret Brennan reports, President Trump will hold another meeting today to discuss school safety with state and local officials.
I want to listen, and then after I listen, we're going to get things done.
One by one, survivors of school shootings and their family members shared their pain.
And I'm pissed, because my daughter I'm not going to see again.
I lost a best friend who's practically a brother.
People are dying, and we have to stop this.
And I'm just begging for a change. We need a change.
Andrew Pollock lost his 18-year-old daughter Meadow in the Florida shooting.
My daughter has no voice. She was murdered last week, and she was taken from us. Shot 9 times on the 3rd floor. We, as a country, failed our children.
Pollock asked for more school security, but said it's not about gun laws. Senior Sam Zeif, whose best friend died in the massacre, wondered why it was so easy to buy an AR-15, the assault rifle used by the shooter.
I don't understand why I could still go in a store and buy a weapon of war.
As for possible solutions, President Trump focused on strengthening background checks, increasing mental health services, and even arming school staff.
If you had a teacher who was adept at firearms, they could very well end the attack very quickly.
This is my son, Daniel.
Mark Barden lost his 6-year-old son just over 5 years ago in the Sandy Hook Elementary School massacre.
School teachers have more than enough responsibilities right now than to have the awesome responsibility of lethal force to take a life.
It did make a difference. They needed to hear it from us students.
Now we're leaving it up to him to make the change that we need.
After meeting with the president, CBS News spoke with some of the students who said listening is not enough.
He heard our cries, and he talked to us, And I think he understood where we were coming from, but the NRA wasn't there.
Zife said arming teachers is not the answer.
This is a problem because guns were brought into our school. Why would it make sense to bring more guns into school?
Well, that was our Margaret Brennan reporting there. And now CBS News has named Margaret Brennan the new moderator of Face the Nation. Margaret has been the White House and senior foreign affairs correspondent here at CBS.
She takes over at the Face the Nation for John Dickerson this Sunday, who is now, as you probably know, the co-host of CBS This Morning. Margaret has worked for CBS since 2012 and has extensive experience covering the White House and the State Department. You can watch Margaret Brennan on Face the Nation this Sunday on CBS. You can also watch right here on CBSN, Sundays at 11 a.m. and 6 p.m. Eastern.
We congratulate Margaret.
Yeah.
We're so happy for her. This is really great news, and we know she'll do an amazing job.
She will.
Well, the message from survivors of the Florida school shooting is resonating across the country. Students from Washington State to Washington, D.C. walked out of schools yesterday demanding stricter gun control laws.
More than 1,000 people rallied outside Florida's state capitol while students from Stoneman Douglas High lobbied state lawmakers.
Coming after you. We are coming after every single one of you and demanding that you take action, demanding that you make a change.
If we are going to protect our future, why are we not protecting our children? Well, Anne-Marie, it was a mixed bag. We spoke to some students who said, you know what, lawmakers really listened to us. They treated us like adults. They treated us like we were valued. And we asked them pointed questions. We sat inside 3 of these meetings, and the students were incredibly specific. They said, you know, what is your position on assault rifles? Do you think all of them should be banned? If assault rifles are not good for hunting, these students said, because they're so powerful that they would destroy whatever was shot with it, why are they legal? Why are they not just reserved for the military? And when the lawmakers replied, they looked for areas where they could agree. You know, the lawmakers I saw were very sympathetic toward the students. They spoke about the need for better mental health checks within the background check system, but we heard a lot of vague answers. There were some points that lawmakers weren't ready yet to really take a specific position on, but they said they wanted to look into some issues. So they seem, at least from our perspective, from what we saw, open-minded. And the students told us that they appreciated the candid discussions that they had. They felt supported, and they felt, one girl told me that she felt like something positive was going to come from this in terms of what she wanted. But other students thought they got the runaround, and they thought this was politics as usual. And toward the end of the day, the energy really escalated on the 4th floor of the Capitol, where students gathered and they started protesting, holding signs. It was emotional. You know, you could see the anger on people's faces, and they wanted the people inside the House chamber, this is right outside, to hear their message. And you know, you couldn't not hear it, because students were outside the Capitol, they were inside the Capitol, they were protesting, they were in the galleries of the chambers. I mean, the students really flooded this area, both inside the Capitol and outside.
Adriana Diaz, you know, it was just, I've said this to you yesterday, knowing that many of the student sit-ins, many of the attempts to change segregation in the South in the late 50s and early 60s came about because of students. It wasn't an easy road, but ultimately it led to change. Hopefully we're seeing a little bit of that here today. Adriana, thank you so much for your reporting. We appreciate it as always. Well, coming up, we are learning more about the funeral plans for the late Reverend Billy Graham, including how you will get a chance to pay respects to the world's best-known evangelist.
And take a look at this fiery explosion on a ferry boat in Mexico. We'll tell you how the survivors are doing. Keep it right here. You're streaming CBSN. This dramatic surveillance video shows an explosion on a ferry in Playa del Carmen, Mexico. Investigators are trying to determine what caused the blast yesterday.
As many as 25 people were hurt, including at least 7 Americans. Security camera footage shows the moment a fireball ripped through the center of the ferry. The boat had just docked at the beach town of Playa del Carmen. Passengers were still disembarking when the explosion sent debris and shrapnel into the water and the crowd. Emergency crews rushed to the scene and tended to the injured. Mexican officials say 18 people were taken to the hospital. Images of the aftermath show a gaping hole in the center of the ship.
From my right side, I just heard this loud boom.
Rebecca and Steve Lallam's family were on the dock waiting for another ferry to Cozumel when the blast happened.
There was a lot of debris in the air. There was a lot of glass. There was others that had been knocked. They fell so quickly when the blast happened that they had fallen unconscious because they had just hit the ground so hard.
The couple's 2 young sons suffered minor cuts and bruises from the explosion. They were taken to the hospital where they received stitches and were released.
Emergency responders showed up very quickly. Police were there very quickly.
Others were definitely not as lucky and have a little more recovery than we do.
No one was killed. Local officials say preliminary reports indicate the explosion was due to mechanical failure. A deeper investigation into exactly what caused that failure is ongoing.
Well, it looked pretty bad.
I mean, when you see that footage, it's just remarkable, thankfully, that no one was more critically hurt.
Yeah. Well, the fate of a convicted Texas killer is in the hands of the state's governor, Greg Abbott. Thomas Bart Whitaker is scheduled to receive a lethal injection later today after arranging the killings of his mother and brother at their Houston home in 2003.
Whitaker's father, Kent, was also shot but survived and has led the effort to save his 38-year-old son from execution.
I would like my son to be allowed to live so that he can continue to do some of the things that it's doing now behind bars.
The state parole board has recommended Whitaker's life be spared. The final decision is now up to Governor Abbott.
The Reverend Billy Graham, the world's best-known evangelist, known for his stirring sermons, will be buried a week from tomorrow in North Carolina. The public can pay their respects in Charlotte on Monday and Tuesday while his body is in repose.
David Begnaud is inside the Billy Graham Library in Charlotte, near the place Graham will be laid to rest.
Yes, Jesus has the answer to life's problems.
Reverend Billy Graham's funeral service will be held under a tent. It's a fitting venue for someone who rose to prominence, preaching under the Canvas Cathedral in Los Angeles.
That the Lord Jesus Christ can be received, your sins forgiven, your burdens lifted.
Invitations to next Friday's private funeral service have been extended to President Donald Trump and all former presidents who are still alive. Barack Obama called Billy Graham a humble servant who gave hope and guidance to generations of Americans.
When I touch that podium, I can feel a new strength and a new power come.
Known as America's pastor, he will be buried in a casket made by prisoners. It's a pine plywood box lined with a mattress pad. Spokesman Mark DeMoss said Billy Graham died at home. No one else was with him except for a nurse. His doctor said Graham just wore out.
I think we can say he passed in his sleep. It was described by the nurse and his doctor as a very peaceful passing. He was not in any pain.
His life was not without controversy.
I told you one time that the Bible talks about 2 kinds of Jews. One is called the synagogue of Satan.
A taped phone call between him and President Nixon drew criticism from the Jewish community. His ministry also supported a ballot measure banning gay marriage in 2012. While his views were controversial, televangelist Joel Osteen calls him a hero.
Growing up as a little boy, coming from a preacher's kid, you know, we watched him on television, and so he was somebody that we always looked up to and admired.
Here at the Billy Graham Library in Charlotte, North Carolina, everyone enters through the cross. That's exactly how Reverend Graham wanted it. You know, when his family came to him and talked about the idea of a library, he hated the thought that it would be a memorial or a museum to honor him. But when they came back and said, well, Daddy, what if we do it as an ongoing ministry? He liked that idea. Billy Graham, we're told, planned every aspect of his funeral and signed off on the final plan.
David, your live shot position is in the entryway of the library, and it's absolutely breathtaking in its simplicity. It's not, you know, it's just with the woodwork and the automobile in the background. You mentioned the funeral. I wonder if you could give us a couple of details about what you know.
Absolutely. The funeral will be closed to the public. It's invitation only. We expect that there will be high-level dignitaries, possibly former presidents, who will come. Let me take you outside and show you. First of all, a little look at the property. As you come out of the museum, workers have been for the last 24 hours putting in new sod and flowers to get the place ready. That is the childhood home of Billy Graham. It's where he grew up. He didn't grow up here. He grew up a few miles down the road, but the house was torn down and then rebuilt right here. Billy Graham's body will be brought here to the library. It will lie in repose in his boyhood home. The public will be allowed to pay their respects. The casket's going to be closed to the public, but that's where the lying in repose will happen. The parking lot houses the international media that's been here for the last 24 hours. We're told the tent, that giant tent that will be where the funeral happens, will be placed right over the parking lot there, and people will take their seats. Again, that tent was so important to the life of Billy Graham because back in the old days, when Billy Graham was doing his crusades, you didn't have coliseums or civic centers, right? So Billy Graham had these tents and wooden structures commissioned for wherever he went. In fact, I just saw a poster in the library that said, here at the Charlotte Coliseum, come see Billy Graham, and a couple days later, come see Elvis. We're walking to what will be the final resting place for Reverend Graham. He's going to be laid to rest right alongside his wife of nearly 65 years, by the way. She is buried here at the library, and Billy Graham wanted the burial, and he wanted the grave to be as simplistic as possible, and he will get that. It's beautiful, though, as you walk to it. Really pretty. But the grave of Ruth Graham, no flowers, not much fanfare, is just ahead of us on the left, and Billy Graham will be buried right alongside his wife. In fact, Franklin Graham said he asked his father one time, "Daddy, what do you want on your tombstone?" And Billy Graham had a one-word response. He said, "Preacher."
I'm sure every detail has been planned for, but I cannot imagine the crowd that they are expecting. Any idea just how many people will be showing up to pay their respects?
It's funny, I just talked to one of the media representatives and he said, we're expecting a ton of people. He didn't put a number on it, but you know, people from all over the world who will come. And again, and every past president who's still living has been offered an invitation. We don't know who will accept, but there's enough seats, we're told, for about 2,300 people, and they expect to fill every one of them.
And you know, he was a confidant to many presidents and other prominent people. Any big names that we know of?
No. Again, have not heard one big name. Not one.
Interesting. And would be appropriate, I'm sure there will be some people that we know that will attend, but it would be appropriate for them to be treated just sort of like everyone else.
Exactly right.
Yeah. David Begnaud, North Carolina, thank you so much.
You bet.
Still to come, Americans impacted by gun violence take their fight for stricter gun control to the White House.
We'll tell you what the president is saying in response to their calls for action. You're streaming CBSN.
news right now? We've got the app for that.
This is CBSN.
We're just on the front lines. Police have surrounded the area.
It's still unclear what caused this fire, why it spread so quickly.
There are flooded homes like the one behind me for miles.
Change is what many people here are looking for.
And now they're trying to pin the ISIS gunmen down.
The marchers were saying, let us march. We want to march.
CBSN, CBS News, always on.
The NRA's Executive Vice President and CEO, Wayne LaPierre, addressed school safety today in the wake of the Douglas Stoneman shooting. Here's some of what he had to say during his speech at the Conservative Political Action Conference in Maryland.
Every day, young children are being dropped off at schools that are virtually wide open, soft targets for anyone bent on mass murder. It should not be easier for a madman to shoot up a school than a bank or a jewelry store or some Hollywood gala. Schools must be the most hardened targets in this country. And evil must be confronted immediately with all necessary force to protect our kids.
Well, all this comes after President Trump spent the morning clarifying his own comments about arming teachers on school campuses. He also called for an end to gun-free zones at schools on Twitter, calling them, quote, a magnet for bad people.
Meanwhile, Vice President Mike Pence addressed the crowd, touching on school safety, border security, North Korea, and the economy. Earlier, we broke down both speeches, starting with the vice president's with our Weijia Jiang and Politico's Daniel Strauss.
Look, that was a strong speech, and it really underscores that he has a strong relationship with the base and that Republicans feel that this administration is doing very well right now. The fact that he started with remarks about the shooting, I think, also underscores the state of the debate on gun control. We're seeing both Republicans and Democrats really review this issue and look for some kind of policy change or some kind of solution to stop these massacres. That's really different than what's happened in past shootings, where we've seen discussions of changes for mental health policy, maybe something on gun control, but really nothing as stark as the talks that are going on now.
Daniel, as you heard, the NRA's Wayne LaPierre echoed the president's call today to end gun-free zones at school. So the answer, according to Wayne LaPierre, in the wake of a horrific massacre at a school where an 18-year-old was able to bring an AR-15 into that school and kill these students, is we need more guns at these schools. And if you went to my high school, where there are a bunch of fifth-year seniors that are 18, they would be legally allowed to carry guns if the school was gun-free. How likely is this initiative to get support in Congress?
Look, I think it's a really, really unlikely idea. Just logistically alone, the idea of arming teachers, going through background checks for teachers and personnel to have more guns in school is fraught and very complicated. So just on implementing it alone, I don't think it's something that we're going to see anytime soon.
So this morning, the president laid out his gun legislation plan in tweets, of course. He included stricter background checks with a focus on mental health, raising the age limit for those who can buy rifles, and ending the sale of bump stocks. Explain what happens next, though. How does the White House move forward with this tweeted out plan?
I mean, you tell me. There are a lot of times that President Trump has tweeted out an idea or a plan and then nothing really has happened on it, or something sort of only vaguely reminiscent of the original idea has happened. In this case, I think we will see lawmakers in Congress put forward some kind of legislation in response to the shooting massacre, but I don't know if it's going to resemble at all anything like what Trump tweeted out.
So, Daniel, where is the NRA willing to compromise? There was a congressman, I forget his name, in Florida, who, in the wake of the Pulse shootings, changed his position on weapons, on guns. The NRA had given him money. They stopped giving him money, and he was unable to be effective. Is there any sense from your colleagues there at Politico, other reporters you've spoken to, the NRA perhaps, that they would be willing to compromise at all? When the president says he wants to raise the age limit, that would seem to me that would go against most of the principles and ideals of the National Rifle Association.
Yeah, look, I think we're going to have to wait and see on that. The issue here really is that the NRA has always been very active in arguing that more guns, not less. A good shooter is the best response to a bad shooter. I think we have seen them sort of change their tune on bump stocks, and I think that's a big thing. That is a sign that the NRA is not totally unwilling to change their positions in general. But anything massive for them is going to seem sort of small compared for gun rights or anti-gun control advocates. So I think possibly we could see something from the NRA on maybe changing their policy on the most aggressive automatic weapons, but I don't think we're going to see any changes on something like concealed carry.
So, Daniel, I want you to sort of stand by. We want to bring in Weijia Jiang. Weijia, you're at CPAC. We just listened to the vice president address the crowd there. How was he received?
Well, it depends on what he was talking about. There were moments that were silent, as expected, when he was talking about the victims briefly in the Florida shooting. There were moments where they rose to their feet and clapped and cheered when he talked about the accomplishments of the administration so far, when he talked about his personal decision not to stand with the sister of Kim Jong-un during the Olympics. So overall, because this is the first big-ticket speech, it is exactly what we thought, which was a mix. As the country continues to grapple with this debate over gun control, it's not only dominating the conversation among participants, but it's really setting the tone. And I can tell you, compared to last year, when it was just about a month after the president was inaugurated, it almost felt like a victory party here at the conference. But even though there's an optimism because the nature of the conference and them sharing goals, there is a much darker undertone. And so at appropriate points for cheering, that certainly happened when the vice president talked. But I have to say that it feels different because the members that we spoke with, the people here, are very aware that they have to walk that fine line between being empathetic to the victims, but also for standing for their passions, which include the Second Amendment.
You know, Weijia, one of the other questions that I had for you is you pointed out, rightfully so, that last year this did feel like a victory party for the president, for the principles of conservatives and, generally speaking, the Republican Party. But given all that's transpired, and the vice president laid out a very good speech where he talked about the many successes as far as the Republicans are concerned, appointing conservative judges, the economy that is doing very well, the tax plan that they were able to implement, even the stock market, which I would argue the fact that we've seen it weaken slightly is actually a good thing, which does prove that the American economy is strong. Yet there is that undercurrent of this Russia investigation. There is that undercurrent of women that have come out and said that the president of the United States sexually assaulted or harassed them in some instances. And so I'm curious, given that this is the ultra conservative wing of the Republican Party, evangelicals make up a large part of that, if there isn't sort of a pulling back, even as the president's numbers have dipped slightly amongst hardcore supporters, perhaps because of some of those things that they are facing in the days and months ahead.
You know, it's interesting that you mentioned that because we spoke with participants about the general mood for the party looking ahead because we are still only in a relatively new administration, but there is cautious optimism, right? On the one hand, people we spoke with are celebrating those victories and very quick to point out all the things that President Trump said he was going to do and accomplished. On the other, we just spoke with a group from South Carolina who said, frankly, they need to strategize. They need to make sure that they continue using whatever momentum they have, because they're very aware that midterm elections are right around the corner. And while they will continue to praise the president, they also know that the numbers are telling, and he is not popular among many Americans, and he has been sharply criticized for a lot of his policy decisions. So they know that it is an uphill battle, because their biggest concern is that there's a sharp turn during those elections, and then you have a potential for a lame duck situation as the president looks to 2020. But I would say that there is still a lot of optimism, because remember, this is essentially a rally, an annual meeting where it's not only about planning and meeting and discussing, but it is about celebrating what they have done so far.
I'm curious if you spoke to anybody who was there about their feelings about the FBI. You know, we heard from Mike Pence, who said, you know, something about standing, giving law enforcement the respect that they deserve and standing with law enforcement. But Wayne LaPierre, the CEO of the NRA, was critical of the FBI.
As have a lot of Republicans. They've been
recently. Yeah, well, yeah, right. No, it's not just the Russia investigation, but now on top of the Russia investigation, we have the shooting in Florida. I'm wondering what the general feeling is amongst those conservative members about the FBI.
You know, in the context of the gun debate, certainly we did talk to people. We just spoke with a mother who said, you know, yes, she supports the Second Amendment, but really pointed the finger at the FBI for not being proactive when they received tips about the shooter in Florida, and for not really taking more action and having more resources to investigate tips. And it was interesting because you could tell that she was struggling with, you know, wanting to maintain what she believes are rights, but also being very aware as a mother that this could happen to her own children. But she did not put the burden on Congress or the president to tighten up gun control laws, but rather on investigators from even her local police, and doing more at schools, to the FBI following up on tips, making sure they're monitoring and tracking potential mass shootings. And so that is part of the conversation here. It is a target, as you mentioned, for the NRA, because they're not going to come out and say, you're right, we need to have stricter laws when it comes to guns. But certainly they can shift that narrative to, we need to have stricter regulations and enforcement of the laws already on the books.
Let's go back to Daniel Strauss. We just stand by. We'll come back to you. But Daniel, you're in Politico's offices there in Virginia. And, you know, the point that we were just making about the criticism that we've heard from not just Wayne LaPierre, the head of the NRA, but other Republican members of Congress criticizing the Federal Bureau of Investigation, criticizing law enforcement in the case of missing some of these red flags. We had Dan Senior, who I know you know very well, here. Dan is a well-known political operative, a political analyst for the Republican Party. And Dan said to us, that he was surprised. He never thought that in his lifetime he would hear conservatives, Republicans primarily, criticizing the FBI. Now, the FBI has been criticized in the past. You would think that actually the right and the left would be able to come to some consensus that the FBI has not always had a pristine history, shall we say, when it comes to law enforcement in this country, particularly when it was headed by J. Edgar Hoover and during the Civil Rights Movement, and some of the things you learned about what they did, the tactics they employed against Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But I wonder, are you surprised to hear at this CPAC convention, forget the politicians, forget the members of Congress, but just sort of the rank and file sort of also voicing this what's the word I would use for the way that they feel about the FBI?
It is criticism, and I think, you know, to a certain degree, distrust.
Distrust.
Yeah, I mean, look, it is a contrast from past CPACs that I've attended where the FBI didn't come up. And it's an unusual discussion at a time when the President of the United States is having to deal with an FBI investigation into the 2016 election. But I guess this really sort of underscores really the support President Trump has among the CPAC-going base of the Republican Party. He's criticized the FBI and Mueller in the past, and we're hearing echoes of that at CPAC. It's very unusual, though.
I think that's fascinating, sort of differentiating between the support at CPAC for the Republican Party and the support for the president. I mean, that's one of the things that I think the Republican Party is going to have to grapple with moving forward into the midterm elections is, and we saw this with the special election in Alabama, is whether or not the support for the president can be transferred, and whether or not the NRA can criticize the FBI, and perhaps the president can criticize the FBI, but they may not want to hear it from, say, their congressional representatives.
Absolutely, and Daniel, as you know, it's not. I heard Vice President Pence say that's why we have to ensure that the Republicans maintain control of both houses of Congress. That, he said something along the lines of, can you imagine Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer as speakers of their respective houses? The reality for Democrats is this is not an uphill battle either. They cannot just simply run on saying, we oppose everything that Donald Trump is doing, because millions of people voted for him and millions of people still support him and his policies. And, Alabama was a unique situation. It was an alleged pedophile that he was running against. That state, for those who are watching, is not representative of red states in this country.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think Vice President Pence's line in there, warning about the possibility that Nancy Pelosi could become the Speaker of the House and Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer could become Majority Leader, is a real sign that even though the generic Republican is ticking up on the generic ballot for 2018, there's still a sense and a worry among Republicans that they could lose at least one and possibly both chambers. There is a heightened sense that that is a possibility. Democrats, though, are not completely